In this video, I will show you how to do some watercolor techniques using tube watercolors. First, I'm going to put some watercolor onto my palette. You'll notice I'm not putting a whole lot on the palette, about the size of a pea or so, like a green pea. And the reason why we don't use very much here is because we will be adding some water to the pure watercolor there. So we'll end up with a lot more paint than it might seem like. And here you can grab any colors you want. I recommend grabbing, 3 to 4 colors or so. You can grab more than that, but 3 to 4 is a good place to start. White is always the color we run out of first. So we do have some extra colors or extra tubes of white that you can use as needed. So I have my watercolor ready. I also have my watercolor brush, which is a brown handled brush with the natural bristles. It's a round brush. And now I'm just using some water to get part of my paper wet. I'm not going to do all of my paper, simply because if I try to do all of it at once, it's going to dry in the meantime. So I just do a little bit at a time. And as I'm putting my water down, I can also go ahead and get my watercolor wet. So here I am adding some water to the watercolor paint. So we're going to kind of get it more liquefied. And then I'm applying the watercolor on top of the area that I got wet first. So this is what we call wet on wet. This is a technique for creating backgrounds and just kind of that traditional typical watercolor look. You can mix colors together. You can do all sorts of cool effects with the wet on wet technique. Basically, the watercolor paint will only go where the water goes. So that's kind of a cool thing to know, and a way to control the watercolor is to get your paper wet first. So here I am adding more water to my paper, and then I will add some more watercolor, and you'll see it kind of blooms around and moves around a little bit. It's a little unpredictable, but I like that, and that's one kind of cool part about using watercolor. It's kind of a unique feature of using watercolor. So I'm just doing more wet on wet, and then next one I will move on to will be wet on dry. So using wet paint on dry paper. We won't be getting the paper wet after this. So I'm just going in and adding some areas where I thought it just needed a little more saturation, a little brighter colors. So feel free to make adjustments, and we really want to paint to the edge of our paper. I know the tape might be a little bit in the way, but work on getting it to the edge. We're trying to cover up as much of the white as we can. And now I'm doing wet on dry. So this is taking your wet watercolor, which your watercolor should be wet anyways, and you're just applying it to dry paper. So in this case, I did not get my paper wet first. This is kind of like your normal watercolor, typically what you would do maybe when you were younger or in elementary school, just directly applying the wet watercolor onto the dry paper. And you can still mix colors, but you see it doesn't spread as much. It definitely gives you more control to do more details and saturation in different specific areas. Now I'm just drying off my brush, so using a paper towel is really useful for that. And then I'm just going to very gently dab my brush into some of the watercolor. And in this case, I'm not getting my watercolor super wet, so I actually want it to be almost like straight out of the tube. And I'm just brushing back and forth, and you can see it does this really cool texture, really good for doing like grass or trees or any kind of texture you want in your painting. And the next technique we're going to do is using some watercolor pencils. And these are watercolor or Crayola pencils. Double check that they're watercolor anytime you start using these, because sometimes students put them in the wrong place. And these watercolor pencils are awesome because they act just like a normal colored pencil, but you can actually dip them in the water, or you can do what I was doing there at the beginning and kind of just acting like they were a regular colored pencil and apply some water on top, and it'll turn it into paint. So you'll kind of see how this works shortly. I'm kind of varying it up here. I'm changing colors, and you can see I can sometimes keep my pencil lines, and then other times if I color really gently and softly, it'll just turn into like basically watercolor paint. I really like to use watercolor pencils because it allows for more precision, and it's just kind of nice. It's a good bridge between drawing and painting. If you really like drawing, sometimes the watercolor pencils are kind of a nice link. So here you can see I'm just applying the water and it's turning my watercolor pencil into paint. I can't even really see my pencil lines anymore. In some areas where I pressed kind of hard with my brush or with my pencil, you can still see the pencil lines, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but just something to be aware of. If you are doing this technique, you may or may not still see some of your pencil lines. So you can see how saturated that is too. Like the colors are pretty bright. I just love how bright those watercolor pencils can be. And now I'm just kind of spreading out some of that area, and I'm going to continue doing some more wet on wet as well. I went ahead and got that nice and wet for salt, so I'm just pouring on some table salt, and we just leave the salt on there. So we're not going to mess with this. We're going to leave it on there until it dries and we can brush it off. And you can do this anywhere there is wet watercolor. It won't work unless the paper is wet. So you have to work kind of quickly when you're doing salt. And it's the same thing with the rubbing alcohol. So it won't work unless your watercolor is wet. And then you can apply the rubbing alcohol, which will be the next one, I believe. So very similar. Salt and rubbing alcohol are very, very similar to each other, and work in similar ways. They just do different effects. So the salt can do this kind of cool speckled texture, just kind of adds a little variety, and then the rubbing alcohol, which you'll see shortly, it does kind of a cool bubble effect. And you'll see what I'm talking about here. So this is my rubbing alcohol in a little cup, and I'm just going to use a brush and dip my brush into the rubbing alcohol. I don't need very much, just a little bit. And it's kind of hard to see at first, but you'll see wherever I put the rubbing alcohol, it's going to push the pigment away or push the color away. And this is kind of what's called a resist, and you're resisting the pigment from going into that spot. I'm also kind of splattering it here too, so you can do like really big spots or small spots, and if you splatter it, it'll kind of do a splatter effect as well. So you can see how it creates those interesting cells and can do some really unique, almost like bubble texture in there, which I find really aesthetically pleasing. And I'm just putting it in a few other areas that are still wet. The cool thing about watercolor is you can always get it wet again, so you can go back and add more water to your paint, and you can also go back over and layer paint as well. So if you have any areas that are just too light, or if you feel like they're just too white, then you can go back and add more color. Now, I kind of skipped ahead here, but you can see me doing splattering. So you can see me using my finger to kind of flick the paint onto the paper here, and it is creating a splatter effect on there. So you can get some really cool spots and dots and drips by using wet watercolor and just splattering. So feel free to use a variety of colors and really layer the colors onto each other. You can get some really cool effects with that too. You could also try just splattering water or splattering whites, and kind of playing around with that and just having fun with it. There's some, it's also kind of a fun thing to try out. Try black or white or gray, or just plain water and see what happens. And like I did before with the rubbing alcohol, you can kind of see how that works too. So now that I've done all of my 7 techniques, now I'm just going in and kind of just making my own adjustments here, filling in areas that I feel like are maybe too light. There's still some salt drying there, which is fine. We're just gonna let it sit there. I could add more salt. I can, I think I add a little more rubbing alcohol later too. So just going in and filling areas in. I'm trying to fill in my paper as much as possible because we're going to be cutting this up. So I'm not so worried about composition here. I'm just trying to fill up the space in interesting ways with colors that I like, textures that I like, and just kind of having some fun with it. So the next step after this is to let it dry, and then I will be tracing shapes on the back, cutting them out, and then assembling them as a watercolor mosaic.